buenas tardes. A nombre del Consorcio de Universidades por la Ciencia, Fundación UNAM, Colegio Nacional y el conjunto de instituciones en México y en el extranjero, les agradecemos el interés en este ciclo de conferencias que nos acompañan. El día de hoy tenemos una conferencia muy especial sobre el interior de la Tierra. La parte del manto, que es la mayor parte de nuestro planeta, y en donde se dan los procesos que ocasionan las erupciones volcánicas, los temblores, y que hacen que nuestro planeta sea un planeta muy, muy activo. La conferencia está dada a cargo de la doctora Bárbara Romanowicz, que es profesora en la Universidad de California, en Berkeley, y es también profesora en el Instituto de Física del Globo en París, y es miembro del Colegio de Francia. Thanks, Barbara, for accepting the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor having you here. And this seminar cycle is on research projects, research studies, and this is the main characteristic of this program. We are presenting what is being done in science and technological development. The seminar cycle is organized by a group of universities in Mexico, the US, France, Spain, UK, Brazil, and is part of a very large network, and is supported by the UNAM Foundation and the Colegio Nacional. Tenemos el placer de que nos acompañen el presidente de Fundación UNAM, el licenciado Dionisio Meade, y la doctora Valerie Barbosa, quien es la encargada de la colaboración científica en la Embajada de Francia en México. La colaboración con la Embajada es extremadamente importante y nos ha permitido tener un contacto muy interesante y muy directo con las instituciones de educación superior y de investigación en Francia. Dr. Barbara de Romanowicz is a professor in the University of California in Berkeley, and she has a very interesting academic background. She has studied applied mathematics, astronomy, geophysics, and has a doctorate degree in the University of Paris and the doctorado de Estado in the University of Paris, and has received the most prestigious awards in earth sciences, in earth and planetary sciences, including the Wegener Medal from the European Geosciences Union, the fellowships from the American Geophysical Union, the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, is a member of the Academy of Sciences in the US, and she has specialized in how the interior of our planet works. She has developed some of the most powerful numerical models for understanding the interior of the planet, how it works, how we have this connection on the surface with the volcanic eruptions, the earthquakes. So it's and we feel really very honored that Barbara has accepted to present the studies she is doing. She has a very strong group, research group, in France and the US, and well, it's actually an international group. Durante la presentación tenemos tiempo para preguntas, las pueden hacer por las diferentes plataformas, y le voy a pasar la palabra al presidente de Fundación UNAM, Dionisio Meade, y después a la doctora Valerie Barbosa, quien nos dirán unas palabras y sobre todo la importancia que reviste la ciencia y la tecnología para el desarrollo de nuestros países. Y con Francia tenemos además de una estrecha amistad y un largo y muy rico legado, tenemos una multitud enorme de proyectos y de estudios que se hacen en todos lados. Muchas gracias y le pasamos la palabra al licenciado Dionisio Meade.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Buenas tardes a todos. Es otra vez un privilegio estar con ustedes en esta jornada donde hoy hablaremos nuevamente de nuestro planeta Tierra. Agradecemos la presencia de la doctora Bárbara ROMANOWICZ, de la doctora Valérie de la Embajada de Francia, y confirme el acierto de haber constituido este consorcio de universidades por la ciencia. Justamente hemos en otras ocasiones hecho referencia a que la pandemia trajo consigo muchos desafíos y muchas limitaciones, pero esas no fueron suficientes para bloquear la capacidad, la inventiva y el deseo de superación de la investigación científica y tecnológica. Y esa respuesta en este caso ha sido a través de los consorcios por la ciencia, que originalmente a través de 14 universidades, yo ya más de 20, pues se ha venido enlazando para tratar de compartir conocimiento, de compartir interés, de compartir en los estudiantes y en los profesores este ánimo de superación por conocer cada vez más los problemas de la ciencia. Una de las lecciones que también nos ha dejado la pandemia, uno de los elementos que ha traído también consigo, aparte de estas capacidades de comunicación que hoy tenemos enfrente, pues es justamente la de conocer mejor nuestro planeta. Y yo creo, alguien tiene su teléfono, su micrófono encendido y hay resonancia. Entonces, yo creo que es muy importante que cobremos conciencia de que tenemos que cuidar nuestro planeta. Y en estas investigaciones en curso estamos aprendiendo a conocerlo mejor. Y eso yo creo que es algo que tenemos que ponderar mucho. Nuestro planeta es un planeta vivo. Hemos visto cómo se va comportando, cómo se va modificando, cómo se va generando nuevos perfiles y nuevos comportamientos a través de la historia, y cómo el hombre, a pesar de su presencia tan reciente y tan joven en nuestro planeta, pues ha venido incidiendo también en parte del comportamiento que hoy tenemos enfrente. Algunos para bien y otros para mal, y yo creo que, por ejemplo, los temas del cambio climático, pues son sin duda algunos de los desafíos que hoy todavía tenemos enfrente. Esta inquietud del hombre, por cierto, no se ha agotado ya en el planeta Tierra. Hoy tenemos también una presencia en Marte, a donde queremos conocer también qué está pasando, cómo se gestó este origen de nuestro universo, y esto obedece pues a esta inquietud, a este interés y a esta respuesta que busca el hombre para proteger nuestra casa común. Hoy celebramos la presencia de Valérie, que también significa también dentro de nuestro consorcio otro rostro amable para conversarnos lo que significa también este esfuerzo por impulsar la tecnología y el desarrollo científico. Queremos subrayar nuestra gratitud nuevamente al doctor Jaime Urrutia, desde el Colegio Nacional, desde la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad y desde nuestro propio consejo en la Fundación, pues ha sido un impulsor de este intercambio, de esta capacidad de conocer, y ha estado detrás también de este consorcio que ahora estamos potenciando y que está significando desde nuestro punto de vista un esfuerzo inédito para tratar de potenciar estas capacidades de intercambio entre las distintas universidades. Esto es respuesta, creemos nosotros, de este nuevo mundo que se está imponiendo ya. Después de la pandemia el mundo no será igual, el mundo será diferente, y este mundo del futuro se está sembrando ya a través de estas capacidades, a través de estas actividades y a través de este intercambio, en donde se suma el conocimiento, en donde se suma la investigación y en donde se comparte lo que se está conociendo, con algo muy singular. Estas presentaciones recogen investigaciones en curso, de manera que quienes tengan la oportunidad de participar, y nosotros nos beneficiamos de estas presentaciones ahora de la doctora ROMANOWICZ, justamente es lo que se está estudiando, lo que se está avanzando, y tienen la generosidad y la capacidad de compartirnos este conocimiento. Lo agradecemos sinceramente, y yo creo que a través de este esfuerzo, a través de estas pláticas, habremos de cobrar conciencia de la necesidad de cuidar cada vez nuestro planeta, cada vez más, porque es nuestra casa común. Bienvenida, doctora, gracias por su presentación. Bienvenida, Valerín, gracias por la presentación. Gracias de nuevo, Jaime, por darnos esta oportunidad. Buenas tardes a todos, y con el mayor interés de escuchar esta presentación.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos los que nos están viendo. Antes que nada, pues quisiera agradecerle muchísimo a los organizadores de este evento, y en particular a la Fundación UNAM, a la UNAM y al Colegio Nacional por su invitación a participar en el mismo. Para los que no conocen muy bien esta institución, el Collège de France es una institución pública que cumple desde el siglo XVI, digamos, con dos misiones que son sumamente importantes y complementarias. Por un lado, se trata de impulsar el desarrollo de una investigación científica atrevida, o como diríamos ahora, disruptiva, y al mismo tiempo contribuir pues a su transmisión y a la enseñanza de todos los resultados y de los conocimientos que ahí se generan. El Collège de France está organizado en cátedras y cumple un muy amplio espectro de disciplinas, va desde la física, geofísica, antropología, biología, literatura, filosofía. Esta institución es importante, en mi parecer, en todo caso, porque defiende muchísimo esta libertad tan importante que es la libertad de investigación, que es la libertad de investigar, de conocer, de descubrir, y también promueve el debate y la confrontación de ideas y de conocimientos. El aspecto, pues, también sumamente internacional que tiene el Collège de France contribuye en gran medida a la riqueza, creo, y a la intensidad de este intercambio. Y la relación tan fértil que mencionaban, pues, por sobre todo Dionisio, que también platicamos con Jaime, que existe entre el Collège de France y el Colegio Nacional, es un reflejo realmente de la gran tradición de colaboración científica que existe entre Francia y entre México. Por decirles algunas palabras, esta cooperación es muy dinámica. Una muestra, Francia es el tercer socio, digamos, de México en lo que se refiere a copublicaciones internacionales. Entre 2009 y 2018 fueron casi 10,000 publicaciones, se desarrollan más cada año. En el 2018 hubieron 1,200 y abarcaron campos tan diversos como astronomía, matemáticas, biología molecular, informática. Esta cooperación bilateral está afortunadamente respaldada por instrumentos, herramientas que contribuyen a estructurarla. Quiero mencionar 3 de ellos. Uno de ellos es el programa ECOSNOR, que cumple ahora 27 años de existencia, que ha permitido la formación de cientos de estudiantes de doctorado, la publicación de cientos de artículos conjuntos. También existen las estructuras mixtas conjuntas de investigación, las UNI, las LMI, que ahora se llaman International Research Labs o International Research Programs, y que incluyen a instituciones tan importantes como el CNRS, el IRD, el INSERM, y por la parte mexicana la UNAM, al IPN, al CINDESTAD, y muchas más que no voy a citar individualmente. Y también quiero mencionar el programa de becas CONACYT, que le permite a estudiantes mexicanos realizar estudios de doctorado en Francia cada año. Quisiera también terminar citando el Foro Franco-Mexicano de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación. Su última edición fue en el 2018 en San Luis Potosí, y es un encuentro importante porque nos permite elaborar juntos una hoja de ruta que define algunas de las prioridades, pues al menos temáticas, que nos gustaría realizar juntos. De manera un poquito más reciente y haciendo eco a la situación internacional, hemos concentrado incluso más nuestros esfuerzos en que esta relación bilateral tome una dimensión al menos regional e internacional. Nos hemos enfocado en particular en temas que son de alto impacto, como pueden ser las enfermedades emergentes, también puede ser el cambio climático y en especial la lucha contra las agregaciones masivas de sargazo, que me parecen un síntoma de muchas cosas que se están produciendo en términos de justamente de clima y de impacto del hombre en el medio ambiente. Esta colaboración a escala ya transnacional tiene por objetivo hacer mucho más eficiente el uso de los recursos de los que disponemos, a la vez recursos humanos, recursos financieros, y también esto que es tan importante que mencionaba Dionisio, que es compartir. Compartir los resultados, compartir la información, compartir la pericia que tenemos para afrontar estos retos que son realmente globales. También una de las ventajas será que esta estrategia nos permitirá acceder a herramientas de financiamiento europeo e internacional, muy interesantes para todos los equipos implicados. Como lo mencionaba Dionisio nuevamente, pues la situación sanitaria, este contexto de pandemia que atravesamos, creo que ha puesto en evidencia la relevancia o lo esencial que es tener esta colaboración internacional, desarrollar una investigación científica de calidad, que sea ambiciosa, que sea transdisciplinaria, pero sobre todo frente a las fake news y frente a varias situaciones que hemos encontrado, vemos que es sumamente importante no solo hacer esta investigación, sino comunicar de manera más eficiente los resultados de la misma, los conocimientos que tenemos, tanto a los tomadores de decisiones como al público en general. Y en este sentido, bueno, la Embajada de Francia está muy implicada en el desarrollo de programas de comunicación científica, de diálogo, de debate y también de nuevas maneras de transmitir los conocimientos a través del arte, a través también de eventos con innovación tecnológica, como pueden ser hackatones u otro tipo de eventos. Pero en todo este marco ya un poquito más global, el intercambio tan nutrido que existe entre el Collège de France y el Colegio Nacional me parece sumamente importante. Mis más sinceras felicitaciones a los organizadores de este ciclo Universidades por la Ciencia. Obviamente toda mi admiración a Bárbara ROMANOWICZ, que está presente con nosotros el día de hoy. Estoy tan impaciente como el público en ya escuchar su intervención y su conferencia, así que les agradezco mucho su atención, su paciencia y les deseo una excelente tarde. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Sí, y adelante, please go ahead, Barbara. Thanks very much again.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this invitation and for the very nice presentation. I will try and share my screen and put it in full view. Okay, can you see it? Can you see my presentation?
Very well. Thank you.
Okay, so before I start, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators and former students who, of course, did all the work that I will be presenting today. So first of all, my former students, Lekitz, French, Kotar, and Yuan, recent and more recent collaborators, Williams, Mokopachai, and Rudolph at UC Davis, and Davai, Isabelle Panet, and Marianne Graff left at IPG in Paris and the Université Paris-Sud Orsay. We are 50 years after accepting the theory of plate tectonics, and we have a very general view of how plates move. And this cartoon, which is very outdated, shows the sort of rough idea of how the convective motions, the very slow, sluggish motions in the Earth's mantle move the plates at the surface of the Earth, creating new material at ridges and having plates go back down into the mantle in subduction zones. However, this is, of course, a very simplistic view and is not really very realistic. We have many questions still that we would like to answer concerning this whole engine. And in particular, what is the source of the energy that moves the plates? We know that some of it comes from primordial heat and from heat that is being still given out by the Earth's core from the time of the Earth's formation. We know that there are radioactive elements in the mantle that continue to produce heat, but what is exactly the proportion is still not very well constrained, and this can manifest itself very differently. For example, if the mantle is primarily internally heated by radioactive decay, then we expect to see a certain planform of convection with very thin sheets of downwellings and very diffuse upwellings in the convection. This is, of course, what we may think we see near the surface with the very thin plate sheets that come down in the mantle. On the other hand, if a lot of the heat comes from the core, that we are in the case of a fluid which is heated from below and cooled from above, and then we expect to see the so-called mantle plumes of hot material, narrow plumes of hot material that rise from somewhere deep in the earth to the surface. There may be also some more complex structure to the convection, such as what we would call secondary scale convection in the upper mantle, as can be seen in fluids, and also we may have a complexity that the convection may not be driven solely by thermal differences, by differences in temperature, but also composition may play a role, as we can see here in this animation, which I can't get to because yes. So as you can see here, I wanted to show this particular movie to, in particular, show you this is just a simulation under certain conditions. This is not the real Earth, and you can see that something different is happening in the upper part of the mantle. So what do we know about the internal structure of the Earth? Already for many decades, we have a very good idea of what we call the one-dimensional structure of the Earth, which is the part which is spherically symmetric. The Earth is, to a very good first order, made up of concentric shells, the crust, the mantle, the liquid outer core made primarily of iron, and a solid small inner core. And confronting the results from seismology, which gives us the elastic parameters of the materials as a function of depth from the surface to the center of the Earth. So two velocities, shear velocity, compressional velocity, and density. And then confronting that with mineral physics experiments, we have an idea of the average composition. We also have, from geodetic measurements and from the study of elastic rebound due to the warming of the climate, we have an idea that the viscosity of the mantle, which is the characteristic which governs the fluidity of the mantle, or how fast it deforms, varies with depth, and that the mantle is more deformable in its upper parts than in the lower mantle. And although the resolution is not very good, usually that transition from lower viscosity, more vigorous convection, to higher viscosity is put at around 660 kilometers depth, which corresponds to a crystalline phase transition in the component, the olivine component of the mantle rock, which this phase transition being due to the increase in the pressure and temperature as you go deeper into the Earth. So this is our view of the Earth maybe 40 years ago. Since then, the technique of seismic tomography, which uses primarily the travel times of seismic waves that travel through the Earth, to back project and find out the velocity structure, the elastic velocity structure, the material properties of the rock at given locations, has allowed us to produce images of the Earth's interior at very large scales. And so I want to walk you through very quickly through the kind of images that we have become familiar with in the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. What I'm showing here are maps of the shear velocity variations. So it's a local material property that varies laterally, varies depending on the location you are at the surface of the Earth, but it varies in depth also. And so if we cut slices into the Earth, horizontal slices at different depths, we can see these variations, which are here represented with respect to an average at each depth. So this is in percent velocity. And here we have a map at 100 kilometers and then going deeper and deeper into the mantle. The way to look at these maps to first order is that if you see red, it means lower shear velocities than the average the global average. It can be related to higher temperatures than the average. And then the blue is colder than average, faster than average velocities. And if you look first at the depth of 100 kilometers, it is quite striking that you actually see basically this reflects plate tectonics. You see the ridge system, the mid-ocean ridge system here in the Pacific, and then going into the Indian Ocean, and then in the Atlantic, which marks the places where new Earth crust is formed from the magma coming from in the interior of the Earth. And as the plate as you move away from these ridges, you can see cooler and cooler colors, which reflects the cooling of the plate as it becomes older and moves away from the ridge and is replaced by newer crust. What you see also is some red here in the Western Pacific, which corresponds to the back arc regions of where you have volcanism related to the subduction of plates. Here, the Pacific plate going back down into the mantle. And you can see also some blue spots here that mark the very old continents, the very old parts of continents, which are cold and also somewhat different composition. So this image essentially confirms is one more confirmation of the validity of the plate tectonic theory. However, as we go deeper into the mantle, you can see that the picture changes rapidly. So the mantle is 2,900 kilometers thick, and so now we are down to 600 kilometers, and you can see that the main features that you see are these areas of faster than average or colder than average material, which you can relate to the subducted slabs that come down into the mantle. And so to show this in another view, I'm showing here two depth cross sections. So instead of the map view, we're now looking in depth into the mantle from the surface to the boundary with the liquid core. And you can see, here, these cross sections here in the Western Pacific region and here in South America, showing how these subducted slabs, these cold subducted slabs, dive deep into the mantle here all the way to 600 kilometers depth. This line here is about 660 kilometers depth. It's the boundary between the upper mantle and the lower mantle, the phase change, where the olivine gets decomposed into perovskite and oxides. And if you go deeper, this changes still, but you still have some strong patches of blue, which you can relate to other subducting zones here in the Fiji-Tonga area and here in northern part of South America. And what is most remarkable is what happens when you get to the bottom of the mantle. This is 100 kilometers above the core mantle boundary, and the picture has changed completely. You do not see any relation with plate tectonics anymore, no direct relation. You see two large regions of low shear velocity one centered in the Pacific, one centered under Africa, which are surrounded by a ring of fast velocities. We like to refer to this ring as the graveyard of slabs because it seems to coincide with the places where slabs basically end up at the base of the mantle. These two regions have a very ugly name. They are called the large low shear velocity provinces, and we will spend a little time on these. So you also can see the differences as you go deep into the mantle in the scale length of heterogeneity that is found in the tomographic model. If you look at this spectrum, this on the x-axis is going to smaller and smaller wavelengths, horizontal wavelengths. And what I want to point out is the strong energy, which is here indicated in the red color, at the base of the mantle in very long wavelengths, the very, very long wavelengths, which we refer to as the degree 2. And these large low shear velocity provinces are seen in anybody's tomographic model. They are not dependent on the method that you use to construct the seismic tomographic model. These are different groups. The details differ between groups, but they are very well kind of constrained in their large features. And if you filter the structure to its longest wavelengths and represent it here in a sort of quasi 3D manner with the axis of rotation here in the vertical direction, what you see is that these two large low shear velocity provinces are located sort of antipodally with respect to each other and centered on the equator, and that if you plot the paleo locations of the pole of the Earth's rotation, the last 250 years, it actually plots in this ring of fast velocities that separates these two regions. And this is first reminiscent of what you expect in a very simple convective system, so-called degree 2 convective system in a fluid, where you have two upwellings. These would be these located in those large shear velocity zones, and then a ring of downwellings in the planet. And it also suggests that these large low shear velocity provinces may have been stable for at least the 250 million years of the data that we have of the paleo locations of the rotation pole. So what are they, and what is their role in the dynamics of the mantle? Do they play an important role? Are they thermal structure? How long have they been stable? And so if you take 5, so let's look at them a little bit closer. If you take 5 different tomographic models and do this voting map, who thinks the velocity is lower than average? Who in a particular location? Which model thinks the velocity is larger than average, faster than average? You get a very consistent picture with here again this ring of fast velocities. But notice that the borders of these large low shear velocity provinces are quite well defined and very consistent among models. Most of them see them, you see 5 models see red, that is lower than average velocities in a very large region, and all 5 models think or see the ring of fast velocity as faster than average. And if you plot the average velocity as a function of depth in these two regions, in the red region and in the blue region, you see quite a different behavior, which points to possibly a difference in the actual composition of the large low shear velocity provinces here on this side compared to, say, these very dominant region of ring of fast velocities. These regions also have very sharp borders. Since I'm a seismologist, I can't help showing some seismograms, but this is basically a record session. So you have seismograms here as a function of the distance of the station from earthquakes in here in the Pacific observed in an array of stations in South Africa. And you can see, if you look at it as a function of distance of the observations, you see a sharp offset here within a very short epicentral distance. This is the indication that the borders of this large low shear velocity province, this particular one, which is the African one, is very sharp. There are other evidences. I will not spend much time on this because of lack of time. And then recently, a controversy arose. Because these large low shear velocity provinces, or LLSVPs, seem to may have been stable for a long time, it seems that they may be denser than the surrounding mantle. Otherwise, they would very quickly disappear in the global circulations. Well, there was one study based on the analysis of normal modes of the Earth, the free oscillation, standing waves on the Earth, that suggested that actually these LLSVPs are lighter than the surrounding material. On the other hand, another study about at the same time, using completely different approach based on the analysis of Earth tides, found that, or proposed that, in the contrary, the large low shear velocity provinces are denser than average. So what is it? What is the story? Going back to these voting maps, where you compare a certain number of models and see where they agree and where they disagree, two of my former students, Sanne Kotar and Ved Lekits, produced a slightly more detailed kind of view of the large low shear velocity province. And here you see a map of the world centered on the Pacific large low shear velocity province. And so we are deep in the mantle, near the core mantle boundary. And here are depth cross sections of the same. But these are not real models. These are voting maps. How many models agree that the velocities are lower than average? You can see that based on these maps, you would think that these LLSVPs extend very high into the mantle, like at least 1,500 kilometers up above the core mantle boundary, which is here. This is depth. And they are very compact and broad. You can see it very well here in this cross-section DD prime that goes north to south. And so the impression from these maps is that you have some very compact, very large features of lower than average velocity, at shear velocity at the base of the mantle. What you need to understand that these models, before they have been compared to make these maps, have been filtered to long wavelengths. So if there is any internal structure in these features, you would not see it in these maps and in these cross sections. However, this has inspired a lot of work by geodynamicists, and in particular, this kind of work that I am sort of just illustrating here from a relatively recent study, where the geodynamicists have modeled the behavior of a mantle simulation, where the base of the mantle is made up of dense pile materials, and the dense piles are being swept around by the convective system. And this is what it looks like, with these dense, very strong, very compact piles, on top of which you can see some upwelling, very thin, narrow, what we would call mantle plumes, starting at the top of these piles. The sophistication in investigating these piles has been very large, and so some authors have also proposed that they have some internal compositional structure that is layered with a bottom layer, which would be made up of so-called primordial material that was deposited there at the very beginning of the formation of the Earth, and a more shallow, slightly lighter material that would have been brought from over the geological times from the deposition of subduction. So these are some models that are being proposed. And the question is, are these LLSVPs really such piles, or are they maybe something different? So there is a lot of debate on this question, and I borrowed this cartoon from work by my colleague Edgar Nero at ASU, Arizona State University, who very nicely kind of sets the debate. Are the LLSVPs stable domes, metastable piles with or stable piles with plumes rising from the borders of them? Or are they just a bundle of mantle plumes, which we cannot distinguish yet because of the poor resolution, poor sharpness of our images? So this brings me to say a few words about why we are so interested in mantle plumes. We're very interested in mantle plumes because we have evidence that volcanic lavas in so-called hotspot volcanoes, volcanoes that are in the middle of tectonic plates, as opposed to along mid-ocean ridges or in subduction zones, that these hotspot volcanoes have different compositions of lavas, especially in trace geochemical elements. So this is shown here in a typical geochemical plot showing one system of trace elements against another one, showing the distinct pattern of hotspot volcanoes compared to mid-ocean ridge basalts. Another element is the helium in these lavas, which has a very different ratio of radioactive helium-3 to helium-4, where you can also distinguish very clearly the intraplate volcanism, that is the hotspot volcanism, from the volcanism in spreading centers. And where you see that ocean islands in the middle of plates have different composition. And the idea here is, where is that coming from? Since mid-ocean ridges are sampling the rather shallow mantle, these hotspot volcanoes may be sampling a primordial, very old reservoir somewhere deep in the mantle. And so how would they be sampling there? Well, they might be sampling them through the fact that beneath these hotspot volcanoes, we might have plumes, mantle plumes, plumes of hot material rising from maybe the base of the mantle, as was proposed by Jason Morgan in the 1970s. And previously, the whole concept of mantle plume was proposed by Tuzo Wilson, one of the giants of the plate tectonic theory in the 1960s. And these plumes may be sampling a deep reservoir and bringing this unusual material to the surface at the hotspot volcanoes. So the quest for mantle plumes has been, in seismic tomography, has been going on for a long time. The problem is resolution is challenging. This is a remarkable effort of trying to resolve the deep structure beneath the islands of Hawaii. Hawaii is a typical island mid-plate island hotspot volcano with the currently active volcano on the east side, and then progressively older volcanism, extinct volcanism as you go in the direction of the motion of the Pacific plate. So it seems like this hotspot volcano could be under this hotspot volcano, there might be a mantle plume that is fixed with respect to the motion of the plate over time. But if you do standard so-called travel time tomography, it is very difficult to have a large enough aperture, even if you put ocean bottom seismometers around the island, as was done in this experiment by a group led by Cecily Wolf, which because you can see the geometry is that the ray paths of seismic waves in your small region do cross only up down to a certain depth. This crossing of ray paths is an essential component of resolution in tomographic models. And so if the ray paths do not cross, if you do not have crossing ray paths, you can smear the structure that you are inferring, that you are back projecting. You can smear it along the ray path, and in fact, it could be coming from some other part of the Earth. So in this cross section, you can see the images that were obtained here in map view at 200 kilometers and 900 kilometers, and here in depth cross sections from the surface to 2,000 kilometers depth, so almost at the core mantle boundary. And you can see this very strong feature of low velocity, so high temperatures, right beneath the islands, surrounded by some fast velocities. And as you go deeper, you kind of see an extension of low velocities, which you might interpret as the evidence for the presence of a plume. But because of these issues with resolution, this kind of studies has been met with some criticism. The other problem with travel time tomography is that, in fact, if you have narrow plumes, they may be hidden from view, because as the waves propagate from an earthquake to a station and go through this low velocity body, in fact, the first arriving wave does not go through the body because it slows it down. It actually goes around it. So if you only measure the first arriving wave, the time of propagation of the first arriving wave, you will miss the low velocity body. So in order to see it fully, you need to look at an entire waveform. You need to dig into the coda of the wave you are observing. And so this was first proposed by Husnoleh and Tony Dallon at Princeton University, who introduced a method to include what's called finite frequency kernels in travel time tomography. And they made some beautiful pictures of what looks like maybe mantle plumes below some of the major hotspot volcanoes, such as Hawaii, Kerguelen, here in the South Pacific region. But again, these pictures were met with some skepticism because of the resolution issue, and also because these plumes, you had to believe in them to follow them vertically, say, throughout the mantle. So, however, we have the ability to use more than just the travel times of first arriving waves. Seismograms that represent the registration, the recording of large earthquakes as observed around the whole Earth, record many waves that have bounced around the interior of the Earth in many places. And if you can use all of these waves, you have a better illumination of the interior of the Earth. And this has led to the development of so-called waveform tomography, where instead of measuring travel times of individual arrivals of energy, you use the whole seismogram and compare it to a reference seismogram computed in an Earth model that you happen to have, the best possible Earth model that you have. And then you try to interpret the differences between these this synthetic wave field and your actual waveforms. Now, this took a while to develop because you have to be able to compute the wave field accurately in an Earth with a complex three-dimensional structure. In the early days, we used the normal mode theory to do this, but recently, in the last 10 years, we have much more powerful methods based on numerical integration of the equations of motions that govern the motions of the waves. And so we are able to do this much more accurately. I will spare you the details of the techniques, but just show you what these new modeling techniques have enabled us to see in the deep mantle. And so here I'm just showing some examples of what we now see beneath some of the most prominent hotspot volcanoes, which are indicated here as green triangles. And so what I'm showing here, each of these is a depth cross-section from the surface to the core mantle boundary, to the limit with the liquid core, so throughout the mantle, in different regions, across different regions, which are indicated by these lines in these little maps. And so here, for example, we are crossing, we have a swath of the Earth crossing three volcanic centers, Samoa, Tahiti, and the Marquesas in the Southern Pacific. And we see three large structures that are separated from each other, that rise from the core mantle boundary into the mantle, and that seem to end up narrowing down in the upper part of the mantle, end up close to, at least in the vicinity of these volcanic centers. Here's another example in the Pacific near the McDonald volcano, and here are some examples in above the African superplume, or the African LLSVP, which also shows very similar behavior. And these features, you will notice, this is like half of the circumference of the Earth. And at the base, you do not see any continuous, very large low velocity region. You really see a more focused lower than average feature, which of course we tend to interpret at first order as an upwelling, as a region of lower than average velocity and therefore temperature and therefore upwelling. And so this is a model that we derived already a couple of years ago. More recently, other groups have confirmed these features. This is a very recent model by the group in Princeton who have used similar techniques, but not quite the same. The devil is in the details of the way you do the inversion, the tomographic inversion. And again, the details of the models differ, but you see here under Cape Verde, you see a very similar structure. You see its deflection towards in the upper mantle. It's not in the lower mantle. It's not right under the hotspot in both models. Here is the case of Iceland, showing similar features. Now let's go back to what we see at the base of the mantle. I was telling you about those large low shear velocity provinces. In our recent model, these large low shear velocity provinces have some structure, some internal structure that don't look very compact. But the other remarkable thing about this is that most of the structures that we see, these large columns that we can refer to as plumes, they all are based inside the large low shear velocity provinces. These are the black dots that you see here and some of the gray dots. Some other hotspots that are indicated by green do not have any corresponding feature in our model. This may be due to the fact that either they don't have a deep root or because we cannot resolve those deep roots. But certainly there is something special about these very large columns that seem to all be rooted in the large low shear velocity provinces. Another interesting feature of this for the geochemist is that we can trace back the volcanoes that have a helium anomaly. Those of the hotspot that have helium anomaly trace back to the base of the mantle, also in the large low shear velocity provinces. I don't have time to look at this in detail, unfortunately, so let's just skip this. So what about these large low shear velocity provinces? If we filter them, if we only extract the longest wavelengths, we find them very much like we saw them in the models that were developed before the advent of these numerical techniques for full waveform tomography. And we can show that the fact that they seem to be made up, have a very finer structure, is not an artifact, because we can do some synthetic tests where we put in a very compact large pile at the base of the mantle. This is in depth cross section. This is as viewed in map view, and we run it through what we call a resolution test, synthetic resolution test that mimics the procedure that we use for our inversion. And if we do that, we see that we recover them as compact features. We lose some of the amplitude, which is a common issue with the tomographic inversion, but we still see them as compact features. So I will now lead you very quickly through some cross sections through the Pacific Ocean and also on the Atlantic side. What we're going to be looking at is maps here in the left, showing the location of the cross sections, depth cross sections in here, which go from the surface to the core mantle boundary. The broken lines are at 400, 660 kilometers, which are the two well-known discontinuities in the upper mantle, and then at 1,000 kilometers depth for reference, because something seems to be changing at 1,000 kilometers depth, where we have no reason to think that there is a phase change or any other material change in the mantle, at least until today. We start beneath the Caroline hotspot, which is here, and you can see this large feature extending throughout the mantle. When we move a little bit to the east, we are now in the middle of this large patch of the large low shear velocity province, but you can see in cross section that in fact the structure does not extend very high. It doesn't extend more than 300 or 400 kilometers above the comparable boundary. And if you take into account the smearing involved in the tomographic image is not completely sharp. These are very, very, this feature, this very low velocity feature, does not extend high above the mantle. You see a halo of low velocity, but very small anomaly, very small feature, very weak feature. As we move closer to hotspots like Samoa, which is here, and Hawaii, which is here, you can start seeing these halos of these volcanoes, a signature of these plumes related to these two hotspot volcanoes. If we get closer, you see them better, and even closer, you see the signature of the Hawaiian mantle plume, which rises very straight in the lower mantle, but then seems to meander in the upper mantle before it reaches the hotspot at Hawaii, and something similar in Samoa. Note the signature of the subducting slabs here in Fiji Tonga. Here it's Indonesia, and here is Fiji Tonga, which has reached a depth of in excess of 1,000 kilometers in this particular location. You see similar features in the Atlantic hemisphere. Here we see some evidence of plumes below the hotspot of Tristan and Cameroon, and moving further to the east, you see them even clearer. And if you want to interpret them as I would like to, this is the idea we're coming up with. Perhaps this one, which is off, not in the right cross section, so we're only seeing part of it. And moving further east, you see that even more clearly, and perhaps an interpretation might look like this. And finally, in this picture, you see also separate features that we hope in the future to be able to resolve more clearly. Resolution tests show in these two of the last cross sections I showed, the resolution showed that if you put a compact LLSVP extending high into the mantle, you would recover it as compact. On the other hand, if you put in some very strong probably exaggerated structures, separated structures, you would resolve them somewhat. So there are other studies that seem to indicate that the African anomaly is not a single compact structure, that there is a gap in the middle. And so finally, I think this leaves us with the idea that probably what those LLSVPs represent are not really compact piles that are being swept around at the base of the mantle, but more like a bundle of mantle plumes. I guess I should probably stop here because I'm running out of time, but I'll be happy to continue if you think there is time or whatever. I can continue walking you through the mantle and showing more results. But I think maybe this is a good place to stop. What do you think, Jaime?
Well, it's really interesting, and as you wish, we can take some questions now, or we will be happy if you continue.
For another maybe 10 minutes is not too much, or 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, it sounds good. Yes, 5-10 minutes will be okay.
Okay, so maybe I'll skip some. Yes, so this basically the proposed model. There are other interesting features in these structures. For example, the fact that they seem to be rooted in very, very low velocity structures. The contrast here is very dark red, so very hot, or maybe compositionally different. And there is evidence that, in fact, beneath, in the center of these roots, there might be so-called what we call ultra-low velocity zones, ULVZs. These are very, very unusual structures which correspond to very extreme properties of material, velocity reductions of 20 or 25%, whereas on average we expect these velocity reductions in standard mantle materials to be only a few percent. In this particular case in Hawaii, we found by a different study of a student of mine, Zanakota, that we needed an ultra-low velocity zone of thickness of about 20 kilometers above the core mantle boundary and a diameter of close to 1,000 kilometers. So a large feature, but not very high above the mantle, of very extreme velocity reduction. And the question is, we didn't discover these, the existence of ultra-low velocity zones. That was done much earlier by Garnero and Helmberger in the 1990s. But the discovery of these very large ultra-low velocity zones poses the question, as for other such structures, is what are they made of? They could be made of solid iron, because iron has very low shear velocities and high density. But they also could indicate the presence of partial melt. And we prefer the version of partial melt because a study of ours in Iceland, we actually showed that this ultra-low velocity zone has to be almost circular in shape, which points more likely to the presence, to them being due to basically a phase change from partial melt to solid. That would be more easily accommodated in quasi-spherical, cylindrical kind of geometry. The other feature is that these plumes are not your standard very thin plumes that you see in a thermal model, where everything is driven by temperature, contrast between a hot boundary at the bottom and a cold boundary at the top. They are very wide. They are at least 400 to 600 kilometers wide, probably maybe more. We wouldn't see them otherwise, and if they were very thin, in order to see them, they would have extreme properties all along the way, which is quite unlikely. In particular, they have contrast in temperature exceeding 1,000 or 1,500 degrees, which is very likely unknown from the analysis of the lavas in hotspot volcanoes. So they must be compositionally also, they must involve some entrainment of dense material, and this is just an example from a lab experiment from Anne Davai's group, showing the different shapes of thermochemical plumes depending on how much the density contrast is at the base of the mantle in this layer that they are sampling. And so this led us to come up with this kind of ugly cartoon. It's ugly because of the colors, I think, kind of indicating that most likely the lower mantle, but lower mantle defined as separated at about 1,000 kilometers, not the 660 kilometers that we usually think of as being the limit between the lower and the upper mantle, with a very, very sluggish lower mantle with almost not moving, with these bundles of plumes kind of rooted in these ultra low velocity zones and rising upward and then changing. There's a change around 1,000 kilometers depth into a region of more vigorous convection that deflects the plumes. They are not deflected much by what's called the mantle wind in the lower mantle, but they look like they might be deflected and thinner in the upper mantle. So to finish, I just want to show you why this cartoon. I don't have time to talk about the upper mantle and some features that we are seeing now, also kind of pointing to the presence of some secondary scale convection in the upper mantle. But let me just show you very briefly why this contrast at 1,000 kilometers. The 1,000 kilometers depth, you see these deflections in our figures, and also you lose some of the plumes or they become much narrower. And this is very reminiscent of what you observe in laboratory experiments or numerical experiments, as shown here, when you have a plume, a thermochemical plume here, encountering a strong viscosity contrast. In this figure, the viscosity contrast is at 660 kilometers, but in fact, there seems to be something going at 1,000 kilometers, as seen by these plumes, and also as seen by the subducted slabs ponding at this depth, as I showed at the beginning of the presentation. Again, I should stop here. I don't have time to talk about the upper mantle, but let me leave you with this cartoon, which is sort of a schematic interpretation of our present mantle tomographic images. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Barbara. It's a very interesting presentation, and very interesting how you can look inside the Earth. It's an amazing study. We have several questions, and thanks very much for the interest and for sending these questions and comments. I will read some of them. For the first is congratulations, an interesting study. And how long do plumes take to rise? And if they contain material from the core? What is the time scale of plumes?
Very good question. So we think of the overturn times in the upper mantle, right, the circulation to being several tens of millions years. In the lower mantle, it's probably about more several hundred million years, slower motions, and for the overturn time. And the plumes in there will likely take only a couple million years probably to rise from the base of the mantle. And the second question was about whether they could contain material from the core. I'm glad you asked the question, because in fact the studies, I haven't really gone into the details, but the fact that this primordial material that is detected in the hotspot volcanoes, that we can track it to the base of the mantle, to these very large through these very large columns, or very wide columns, very wide plumes, that some of them contain these ultra-low velocity zones. For now, we only have 4 examples of large ultra-low velocity zones beneath plumes. We have one in Iceland, one in Hawaii, one in Samoa, and most recently in a recent study under the Marquesas. There seems to be also a very large ultra-low velocity zones. But one can ask the question, if the primordial material is concentrated in the ultra-low velocity zones, is this a manifestation of something that has been there since the beginning, since the Earth was formed, or are these plumes tapping the core, right? And this, of course, relates to controversies among geochemists about whether, where the anomalous isotopic signatures may come from, whether they come from primordial mantle or from the core. But in my view, it's an open question, and it's not impossible that they are just tapping the core.
Wow. Do we have samples from the mantle? What type of rocks make the mantle?
So we have samples of rocks at mid-ocean ridges, at the places where the new crust is formed. We have samples of the upper mantle, which are made up of peridotites. The main mineral is olivine, more or less 50%. And then there is some garnet and other constituents. But we also have, so this would be like in the oceans, we're tapping the upper mantle under the oceans. And this is what is used as a reference for the composition of the mantle. We also have, can sample mantles in kimberlites, right, in the continents, which gives us some idea of composition beneath old continents, beneath the oldest part of continents. But on average, we get most of our information from the rocks sampled at mid-ocean ridges. And olivine is the main constituent, which is the mineral that undergoes phase transitions to more and more packed crystal structures as we go deeper to higher pressure and temperatures. You go from one first structure, you go to the olivine, so-called olivine structure, to spinel, and then from spinel you go to decomposition to oxides and perovskites at 660 kilometers depth, which has been confirmed from mineral physics experiments and is confirmed from seismology, because we can detect these discontinuities as being very sharp in seismic waves. We see conversions and reflections from these discontinuities.
Okay. Ana Cecilia Elizalde asks if processes on the surface influence in the mantle, including the human activity.
I guess the human activities don't really influence the interior of the Earth very deep. In fact, even the temperature profile, if you go just a couple hundred meters below the surface, you lose the influence of man, right? For example, you can see in the temperature profiles, as you go deeper, as you drill into the Earth, you see the influence of heating by, in big cities, you see that influence, but below kilometers depth or even less, what you see is primarily comes from the internal heat. Yes.
Marcela Elizalde asks about the supercontinent, the Pangaea. How was the mantle in Pangaea?
Aha. Well, so this brings up, I unfortunately don't have any slides prepared to show this, but this brings up a recent study by Xavier Le Pichon and collaborators who have pointed out that in the time of Pangea, well, it brings up this study and also studies by the group in Oslo, Torsvik and others, and Kevin Burke, who have done reconstructions of the continents and have shown that the borders of the that when they can reconstruct Pangea in particular, they end up with having the current large low-shear velocity provinces coincide with the borders of where you see the lips, the large igneous provinces. And Xavier Le Pichon wrote recently a paper kind of suggesting that the position of the African large low-shear velocity provinces influenced how the continents moved, in particular in the case of the formation of Pangea. So there may actually be a strong relationship between the lowermost mantle structures and the continental, dispersal and recombination into supercontinents. What I'm saying today, what I told you about today, is not incompatible. But I want people to realize that we don't, that seismic resolution has not been good enough until recently to really see the details of these structures, and you could still have an influence on the continents even if the LLSVPs are not compact but made up of a bundle of plumes. It's still concentrated regions of hot material.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the questions. We apologize for not taking all of them, but we will try to send them to Barbara and make some comments online. I will just read one more, and it's if the Earth's rotation has an influence in the mantle.
Okay, so that's also a very good question. I showed at the beginning of my presentation that I actually didn't mention it, so thanks for bringing this up, that if you look at the LLSVPs, maybe I can quickly go back to that figure here. If you look at the very longest wavelengths, you see this very special pattern, which with the two LLSVPs equatorially located, antipodal, and surrounded by this ring of fast velocities. This is actually a stable configuration with respect to the moments of inertia of the Earth. So you might think that this corresponds to to something that has to do with the rotation of the Earth. Nowadays, the mantle is too viscous for rotation to have any influence. But way back, when the Earth's mantle was being formed, we have this notion that at some point there was a magma ocean at the base in the deep mantle. And at that time, the viscosity could have been much lower, so that rotation would have played a role and maybe would have led to basically freezing these structures in this configuration. But this is just a a hypothesis. Today, it's not possible to think that the Earth's rotation really influences the motions in the deep mantle, just because of the very large viscosity.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks very much. And there are several messages just saying hello and congratulations. and a comment by Javier Piedad on the importance of the international collaboration and what we can do with France. So, Javier, this is actually one of priorities. We have actually a very large number of congratulations from many different places, including well, several places here in Mexico, in Guerrero, in Yucatan, and we have one from the Technical University of Loja in Ecuador. So, well, thanks and very best wishes from us. And,
thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Barbara. Thanks. And well, the Earth is the only planet in the solar system with plate tectonics, and we think that this makes Earth well, very unique. So muchas gracias a todos. Muchas gracias también a la Embajada de Francia en México por el apoyo en la colaboración con el Collège de France. Thanks to the French, to the embassy, to the French embassy in Mexico, and we invite you to join us next week. We have a seminar on the giant crystals from northern Mexico. These are huge gypsum crystals, more than 12 meters long, by Juan Manuel García Ruiz from the University of Granada. La siguiente semana tenemos una conferencia sobre los cristales gigantes, de los cuales los más grandes están en México, en Chihuahua, en la mina de Naica, que lleva compañía Fresnillo y Piñoles, y está a cargo de Juan Manuel García Ruiz de la Universidad de Granada. Y les invitamos también a todas las actividades que desarrollamos en conjunto con Fundación UNAM, el Colegio Nacional y las universidades, el consorcio Universidades por la Ciencia. Agradecemos también el apoyo de la Asociación Nacional de Universidades, ANUYES, y les invitamos y les agradecemos a ustedes el interés a que nos continúen apoyando. Thanks very much again, Barbara. Really interesting research and interesting how we can look inside our planet. And le pasamos la palabra a nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM y saludamos también a nuestra directora ejecutiva, Araceli Rodríguez. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. No sé si Valeria, que nos está acompañando en esta ocasión, pues quisiera hacer algún comentario sobre el contenido mismo de la presentación de la doctora Bárbara Romanowicz o sobre pues un poquito lo que significa de enormes ventajas este esfuerzo que estamos haciendo. Pues si quisiera hacernos algún comentario, pues encantado, ¿sí?
Se tuvo que retirar.
Ah, ok, perfecto. Pues muchas gracias de nuevo. Agradecemos mucho esta presentación y la verdad es que celebramos pues casi el doble propósito que estamos teniendo con esta forma de compartir investigaciones. Esto nos enseña mucho de nuestro planeta y yo tengo la impresión de que mucho de lo que estamos conociendo pues es fruto de investigaciones muy recientes, de investigaciones en curso. Y la verdad es que lo que nosotros hemos venido aprendiendo es que mucho de lo que se sabe hoy pues se sabe fruto de investigaciones muy, muy recientes, y yo creo que tenemos que celebrar pues, que estemos viviendo este momento tan formidable. Al mismo tiempo, mencionaba Jaime que tenemos escuchas de muchas partes, no solamente del país, sino del mundo, y esto es fruto de que el consorcio pues, nos está permitiendo compartir, como ahora con una gente que de esta especialidad de la Universidad de Berkeley. Tuvimos la semana pasada de Tucson con la parte de sus vínculos con la universidad. La próxima tenemos una presentación de la Universidad de Granada. Y justamente esto está ilustrando, ya tuvimos también del área de neurobiología de nuestra propia universidad de Juriquilla. Entonces, toda esta suma y toda esta diversidad de participantes y de escuchas enriquece la realización de estas presentaciones y nos permite conocer más y mejor este planeta en el que estamos viviendo. Hoy sabemos mucho más que antes de la presentación que nos hizo la doctora Bárbara. Muchísimas gracias por eso y sabemos más de la Tierra y seguramente en una próxima presentación nos dará una información similar de lo que hay en Marte, porque ahora ya parece ser que esa es la nueva frontera de nuestra investigación. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos, les agradecemos su presencia y los convocamos a que nos sigan acompañando en estas reuniones la próxima semana. Ahí está la doctora Valeria, ¿verdad?
Ya llegó.
Ah, sí, pues queríamos preguntarte si tenías algún comentario antes de concluir, pues habiendo visto ya un poco el contenido de la presentación de la doctora Bárbara Romanovich y también pues un poquito el formato que con tu presencia hoy se enriquece.
Adelante, doctor. Valerie, adelante.
Sí, una disculpa, estaba siguiendo la intervención de Bárbara por Facebook, así también pude ver que toda la transmisión funcionó muy bien. Muchísimas gracias por esta presentación, sumamente interesante. Me parece un momentito.
Sí, estuvimos un segundo porque estamos acabando.
Su micrófono, Valerie.
¿Ahora sí?
Sí.
Una disculpa. Entonces retomo. Perdón por el detalle técnico. Sí, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Son temáticas que se me hacen, desde mi punto de vista científico, obviamente fascinantes, pero creo que también resulta, como lo comentábamos antes de iniciar la sesión, extremadamente importante compartir lo más que se pueda todo este tipo de conocimientos. Tal vez para algunas personas la investigación básica sea inaccesible o no sea útil hacia primera vista, y creo que presentaciones como esta nos demuestran no solo que cualquiera que sea nuestra área, cualquiera que sea nuestro background, nuestro nivel, podemos captar lo que nos están compartiendo. También esto requiere muchísimo talento. Muchísimas gracias, Bárbara. Transmitir los conocimientos no es cosa fácil, pero este tipo de demostraciones creo que pueden a la vez mostrarnos qué es la investigación, cuáles son los conocimientos que se están ahorita, actualmente, como decía hace ratito Dionisio, investigación que se está haciendo actualmente, qué se está generando. Creo que puede a la vez provocar vocaciones científicas, que eso lo espero de todo corazón, provocar el entusiasmo del público joven que nos está viendo, y en los demás que no sean del área científica, pues nutrir esta curiosidad, nutrir también tal vez, no quiero decir respeto, pero esta como consideración hacia el conocimiento, entender de dónde vienen las cosas que nos dicen luego en las noticias, entender que hay todo un trabajo detrás de cada uno de los resultados científicos que se pueden presentar en medios, y en este sentido creo que este tipo de ciclos y de acciones son sumamente importantes, sin contar que vienen también a reforzar obviamente la colaboración pues entre Francia y México, que abarca esta área científica, pero también muchas otras áreas, también en el área cultural, en el área artística. Entonces, nada más me queda nuevamente admiración, respeto hacia Bárbara. Muchísimas gracias a los organizadores por esta iniciativa, y ya saben que cuentan con la embajada para poder seguir impulsando iniciativas como estas y fomentando este tipo de colaboraciones.
Muchas gracias. Y mandamos también todos nuestros saludos a los colegas en los centros de investigación y en las universidades francesas y sobre todo al Collège de France. Muchas gracias a la embajada y thanks again, Barbara. A pleasure seeing you, and we look forward for visiting you and the friends in the Collège de France in Paris.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Muchas gracias a todos. My Spanish is not good enough to speak, but I understand it. I also wanted to say that I visited UNAM 5 years ago, and keep very fond memories, and also hope to be able to visit in person someday again. But we'll be very happy to see you all at Collège de France.
Well, thanks, and bye, and adieu.
So I should stay on, or what? Do you want me to stay on now? Or
yes, just
yes, okay.
A few minutes.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Valérie.
Thanks very much.
Merci infiniment, Barbara.
Professor Meade. Yeah.
Merci à tous. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Merci.